Good morning and welcome to our ANZ webinar on securing your business against fraud and scams. I'm Mark Hilreni, a Senior Manager for ANZ, and we'll be joined by Erica Boscato, who from CERT New Zealand. In a moment, we're going to pop up a poll, which will just ask you some questions around whether you've been ever a target of a fraud or a scam. Here is the poll up. So just yes or no. Just get rid of that. Perfect. I have just ticked yes because I have been targeted. In fact, frequently targeted. So look, that's just a quick poll. What we're going to do now is I just need to run through before we hand over to Erica a quick disclaimer. So basically this disclaimer is just saying I won't be giving you any financial advice. This is for information purposes only. So that's all it is. It's not financial advice, just information purposes only. Thanks, B. So you'll see at the top of your screen how you can interact with the presenters, both Erica and myself. You're all on mute because there will be about 320 people on this webinar, so we don't want obviously everybody jumping at once. But you'll see along the in the slide there a Q&A tab. You can just put your questions in there, and we'll have some time at the end just to cover off those questions. So look, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Erica and we'll get into the webinar.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Mark, and thanks to ANZ for having me here today to talk to you all about fraud and scams and how you can secure your business against those threats. My name is Erica Boscato. I'm a Senior Advisor at CERT New Zealand, and I have some expertise in this area, and I'm really delighted to actually be able to share with you the insights on how you can leverage some cybersecurity options to really keep yourself safe against these ever-growing threats from fraud and scams. Thanks, B. Before I launch into it, I thought I might introduce you to CERT New Zealand because you may not have actually heard of us. We're a pretty small government department. There's about 35 of us, and we're a cybersecurity agency. So we have a variety of functions, but our primary function is to help people once they have experienced a cybersecurity incident. And we call that process incident response, kind of self-explanatory there. And what we do is we try and assist those people recover from those incidents and identify what contributed to them being in that situation and to help them prevent it from happening again. That's very much the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and we like to also be the fence at the top. Back to the previous slide, please. We like to try and actually help prevent these issues from occurring in the first instance. So we do a lot of education and awareness work to try and build New Zealanders' cyber resilience. And that includes things like talks like the one I'm giving to you today to actually share with you the insights that we have, because we do gather a lot of information from the things that have gone wrong. And really, if we can leverage those insights and share them with people, we will help to keep our country safe. We also share those data and insights not just through presentations, but with government departments and big businesses so that they can keep ahead of any emerging threats or trends in the cybersecurity landscape. We've recently launched a new website called Own Your Online. Everything I'm going to talk to you about today is actually on that website. So if you do want to learn more, feel free to check it out. I have a link to it later on to share with you. And before we move to the next slide, I'll just end with a quick fun fact. CERT New Zealand, no, it doesn't stand for certificate or certification or anything like that. It's an acronym. It's the Computer Emergency Response Team. So we are a part of a network of global certs around the world that performs this operation for their governments and citizens. Thanks, B. We've got a pretty jam-packed agenda today because there's a lot to talk about in this space, but I've tried to direct it towards the things that I think will be most relevant for you as people who run businesses and the sorts of things that you might see quite commonly. So I'll start by introducing you to what is actually out there in terms of the themes and trends that we at CERT New Zealand see in the cyber threat landscape. And then we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into some of those. In particular, we're going to focus on phishing and credential harvesting, online scams, malware, and ransomware. Now, don't worry if some of those terms are a little bit unfamiliar. I will talk you through some definitions of those, and I'll tell you what they are, how to spot them, how to prevent them, and what to do if you do find yourself on the kind of pointy end of one of those threats. And I'm also going to talk you through CERT New Zealand's top tips to keep secure, which will be equally applicable in your personal life as well as your business life. And potentially, I'll share with you as well also top tips for businesses, which are a little bit more advanced than the tips that we generally give. Really great if you're responsible for security within your organization and you're looking at improving your cybersecurity posture. Thanks, B. So we'll kick off just by getting a bit of a picture about what is out there in the cybersecurity landscape. And CERT New Zealand collects a lot of data, as I said, from the incidents that are reported to us. And we share that because there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff in there about themes and trends as they develop over time and what sort of things are emerging, what sort of things are decreasing. And so it is a really interesting snapshot. Next slide, thanks. Just to caveat this, so I've got up here our 2022 annual report statistics. Two real main caveats around this. As you know, 2022 is a couple of years ago, so we are about to release our 2023 annual report, so we will have updated statistics coming out from CERT New Zealand shortly, but in the meantime, bear in mind these are a little bit old. The other caveat that I put around our statistics is that this is a snapshot of what CERT New Zealand sees. So this doesn't necessarily reflect everything that's out there. We know the true volume is much higher because not everyone reports their issue to us. So let's have a look at it. And previous slide, thanks. Let's have a little bit of a look at the sorts of issues that are most commonly reported to CERT New Zealand. So the highest one we have is phishing and credential harvesting. And when we talk about those examples in a moment, you'll see why that is and why I'll talk you through how to spot those because they are quite common and really problematic. They often lead to other types of attacks. And fraud and scams are also a really high issue that is reported to CERT New Zealand. What we often find is that some sort of cybersecurity incident can give rise to a fraud or scam loss. And what that also means, though, is that cybersecurity measures can be utilised to prevent fraud and scams. So that's why I'm here today talking to you about those, because we find that that's a really useful way to look at how to actually prevent those, because you can't know every type of fraud or scam that's out there, but there are simple things you can do to actually prevent those things from having an impact. Down the bottom, we see a bit of unauthorized access to things like social media accounts or email accounts, sometimes bank accounts too. And you might be interested in the pink line, the malware reports, which generally sit pretty low, but we saw a huge increase in 2020 and 2021. That was due to a particularly nasty malware doing the rounds on people's mobile devices that would essentially self-replicate and send itself to everyone on your contact list if you were unfortunate enough to have received it. That was called FluBot. Now, pleasingly, we can see that that's completely dropped off in 2022. So that was due to some excellent efforts from international law enforcement to shut down that. But it's a really good salient example of quite how devastating some of these cyber issues could be if they went viral in New Zealand. And we were really pleased to observe that, fortunately, New Zealand wasn't the target of this flu bot campaign, and New Zealanders didn't experience any harm that we're aware of as a result. But it's a really good reminder for us to all be mindful of those risks. Thanks, B. So looking at where the financial loss sits, because that's actually quite interesting in terms of having a think about what impacts cybersecurity breaches can have. Now, what we know here at CERT New Zealand is in 2022, around $20 million was lost to cyber criminals. Now, that's a very small proportion of the true losses. So the banking industry actually a few months ago estimated that true loss that their customers had suffered as a result of scams was closer to 200 million. And again, that's probably just reported losses. There's still a lot of misplaced stigma around reporting or being a victim. So potentially the true losses are even higher than that. And when we break that down into what sort of cyber incidences are causing those losses, the majority of it's coming from fraud and scams. Those are the big ticket items where scammers are going after people's money. Cyber attackers are often targeting individuals or small businesses in the hopes that they can trick them into paying funds away under false pretenses, essentially. And actually, when we look at this, we can see that about 6 million of that money lost was where a scammer had gotten into someone's bank account and made an unauthorized transaction. But actually, 2/3 of it comes from people being tricked into making payments, like I said, under false pretenses. And these sorts of things are increasing. So we saw a 32% increase in Q3 of 2023. And we actually see that the majority of scams reported to CERT New Zealand are about online sales and purchases, whether that's imposter sites of legitimate New Zealand businesses or people buying things internationally that turn out to not be what they are. But there's a lot of issues around online sales, and I think as business owners, that's something to be really cognizant of. Thanks, B. So why is this so important to businesses? The short answer is that if you're using your device to manage your business in any way, you could be a target of a cyber attack. And our statistics here at CERT New Zealand show that really anyone could be a target, regardless of their size, regardless of their type of business. They can all be affected by cyber incidents. So when we looked at reporting of phishing campaigns, we saw that being reported across all sectors. So it's not necessarily just a problem for particular types of organisations. So we know some of the really common ones, government departments are often impersonated, but they're not the only ones. That does apply across all industries. And there's also been a perhaps mistaken impression that scammers or cyber attackers are going after high value targets, that they're trying to compromise really big departments or multinational corporates or even big banks. But when we look at where the losses sit, 70% of losses were less than $500. Which shows that scammers are more open to going wider for smaller values than they are to try and attack bigger organizations for larger amounts. Those bigger organizations have a more extensive security system. They have more resources to devote to it. And the scammers have kind of figured that out and adjusted their modus operandi to reflect that it's actually sometimes easier to go after the small guys. And if you are a small business, your ability to respond and recover from that incident may be less than a more mature, larger organization. We also see that the sorts of harms that organisations face, it's not just the financial loss, it includes things like data loss, reputational damage and operational impacts. So if your business does experience a cyber attack, it's not just losing a little bit of money, maybe it's $500, but it could grind all your operations to a halt and really damage your customers' trust and confidence in your business. We actually did some research at CERT New Zealand on people's attitudes towards cybersecurity and what their correlating behaviours were, and the results were really interesting. We were really pleased to see that people were really aware of cybersecurity. So 80% of SMEs said they regularly hear about cyber threats. I think that's quite interesting. That seems to mirror the poll results. 82% of you here on the call today said that you had been the target of a fraud or scam, so you must be aware of them. 98% of New Zealanders can name a cyber threat. That's fantastic. And you're probably like me, that you're probably getting random emails and text messages all the time, pretending I've won something or need to do something. So it's not surprising that people can name those threats. And more there's a public awareness of them. There's a lot of campaigns to bring awareness to these. There's a lot of media attention, and it's really fantastic to be shining that light on these issues so that we can bring them to the forefront and expose them for what they are, crime. But when we looked at people's awareness, we found that it didn't necessarily translate into behavioural change. So even though there was really high rates of awareness about cybersecurity, 59% of SMEs didn't report an issue because they didn't think it was worth it. And a third of New Zealanders say they don't know why cybersecurity is important. And you would think that given the fact that everyone can name a threat, that would mean everyone should appreciate why cybersecurity is important. So we're on a mission here at CERT New Zealand to actually change that. We want to make sure people are aware of how important cybersecurity is and actually how easy it is to do it right, because there's still a bit of a perception that it's really difficult or it's too technical, or really it's for government departments or big organisations to implement systems to protect us. But there are simple things that we as individuals or even SMEs can adopt to keep ourselves safe. Thanks, B. So we're going to go into our first of our three main topics about phishing and credential harvesting. This is a pretty vicious and really prevalent type of cyber attack. And as I said before, it often leads to other types of cyber attacks as well. Thanks, B. So let's start off with actually talking about what it is. So phishing is a type of scam where somebody pretends to be someone they're not to try and trick you into giving personal information or business information. Usually they're after things that will give them access to your bank accounts or your credit cards. So they may pretend to, they may be asking you to confirm your bank account login details. They might be asking you to make a payment for a small amount. Often they're impersonating someone really trustworthy, whether that's government departments that you regularly interact with, like IRD, whether that's telecommunication companies that you may have services with, or even your bank. So there are a lot of phishing campaigns out there that look like they're coming from reputable organisations, and the scammers can almost perfectly mimic those emails or text messages. But the good news is that there's some things we can do to spot these. Thanks, B. So not all phishing emails actually are impersonating organisations, and a lot of the ones that we see, it's a type of phishing we call spear phishing. They may in fact be pretending to be someone within your organisation or someone you have a relationship with, maybe a supplier or a customer. And in these sorts of emails, we can also sometimes call this gift card phishing or voucher phishing. What they're essentially doing is trying to trick you into buying vouchers for them. Now, there's a few things we can do when we look at this example that we've got up on the screen. Immediately for me, the red flag is the email addresses. So the first thing I look at is, where is this coming from and where is it going? We can see this email has been sent from an AOL account to a Gmail account. Now, if you're corresponding with someone in your professional capacity, they'll be contacting you in your work email address. So the fact that these are coming from personal email providers is an immediate red flag that something's not right. I actually received this email myself not so long ago from someone that I didn't know with this exact, "Hi, are you free at the moment?" And for me, when I looked at the email address, it wasn't an email address that could be legitimate. It looked very unusual, and that was an immediate red flag for me to just delete it. In this, it will often start with trying to engage you in a bit of a dialogue before making a request. So the scammers are a little bit smart here. They've found that if you just go in straight away with a request, you may just delete it. So they're trying to kind of build a bit of a correspondence to put some legitimacy around the dialogue before they make the request. There's another thing here that really sticks out in terms of whether this would be legitimate or not. And for me, if I'd received this email, I know that the senior people within my organization have their own company credit cards. There is no reason why anyone would be asking me in the role that I do to do this sort of action. And that's a really good reminder for your staff internally, is making sure that you're clear about financial delegations and who can make purchases, and have safeguards in place to actually ensure that you're following the proper processes if you are making purchases, because we do know that this sort of thing is out there and it is a risk. Thanks, B. Our second example of phishing today, which I alluded to earlier, is impersonating government departments. I've seen these, I've received these sorts of emails, you may have too, and coming up to the end of the financial year, potentially we may see an increase of inland revenue impersonation. So it's a really timely reminder of what we can look for to check that the emails that we're receiving are legitimate. The good news is that it's really similar to what we just did. So let's take a look at the email addresses that each of these are sending to us. The first one for the inland revenue ends in .jp. So that's Japan. Last I checked, inland revenue was based in New Zealand. So that's an immediate giveaway for us that this probably isn't what it should be. You can trust me when I tell you that as a government employee, all our email addresses end in .govt.nz. So if you're receiving an email from someone that says they're from a government department, but their email doesn't end in that, that is almost definitely a scam. We can see the same for the NZTA example. They were slightly more sophisticated because it almost looks legitimate. It ends in nzta.co.nz. But the New Zealand Transport Agency is a government department, so it should be ending in .govt.nz. So those are some really clear giveaways that this is not a legitimate sender. The other thing we can do in these emails is have a look at the language that they're using. In the inland revenue example, it's a really good illustration of something you can be alert to because it's quite flowery, unusual language. It says, in relation to the resolution issued by this provincial directorate of the Inland Revenue Department. That just doesn't sound like something I would expect Inland Revenue to say. Government departments in New Zealand are really big on plain English messaging. So if it's using this sort of flowery, unusual language, that can also be a red flag. But we see that the opposite isn't true. So if you look at the NZTA example, they have used really clear, simple language that does more closely align with how the New Zealand government may communicate with you. And so we've found that, in fact, they're getting better at mimicking legitimate communication. So that isn't necessarily the case that if it looks like the way they communicate that it is them. The other thing we can do is have a look at where these links are directing us to, or where these emails are directing us to. So in the first example, the inland revenue example, we can see that it's asking us to send an email address. Now, they've been a little bit tricky in this one. They've got all the right things. They've got IRD, they've got GOVT, and they've got NZ. But as I just said before, it should be ending in .govt.nz. And in this one, it's govt-nz.com. Now, the -nz.com is a really common method used to make it look like it's coming from New Zealand when it's actually not coming from a New Zealand domain. So keep an eye out for that. Equally true for companies. So if you receive an email from a New Zealand company, it should generally end in .co.nz. But if it's ending in nz.com, that's something just to pause and be really careful about before you take any action. In the second example, again, they are a little bit more sophisticated here. They haven't put an email address or a link in, they've just got a button. Now, to check that button, you can hover your mouse over it and then the link will appear. And again, we can see here, apologies, it's quite small. It's a a very strange looking email address that doesn't reflect what we would expect to see. Sorry, a very strange web link that isn't what we would expect to see. So if you're thinking, well, I don't know the email address or the web address for every government department in New Zealand, absolutely hear you on that one. Jump on Google or your search engine, type in the name, find the legitimate URL, their web page, and that should end in govt.nz. And then whatever that is, it should match. So if it's not matching, if it's not ending in that way, then that's a really good a red flag to signal to you that this may not be legitimate. Thanks, B. Now we'll talk about smishing as well, which is SMS phishing, SMS being text message, an old term phrase for it. So again, we're going to use the same methodology. We'll have a look at where these text messages are coming from. We can see here that they are +61 numbers. These are Australian mobile numbers, and they are purportedly coming from NZTA, poor things, they get a hard time being impersonated, and New Zealand Post. New Zealand Post is a really tricky one because we are often expecting to receive packages, and so they know that is often why they're impersonating NZ Post or other courier companies. But look, those are two New Zealand-based organisations. So why is it coming from an Australian mobile number? That's the first red flag. The other thing we know in terms of where organisations send messages from is because they're sending so many messages, they tend to use a third-party provider, a message provider, to send that for them. And the message will therefore not be coming from a phone number or a mobile number, but from a 3 or 4 digit short code message provider. So that's a red flag as well. Even if it's coming from a New Zealand mobile number, that's not generally how big organisations will text their customers. The second thing we can look at is, again, where it's directing us to. So in this instance, we can see it's close, nzta.govt, but it's not quite what we'd expect to see. Now, it is possible to disguise links. One thing you can do is if you do click on the link, just check that what you've been directed to aligns with what you would expect to see. As I said before, you can jump onto their legitimate website and see if that kind of matches up. If there's significant discrepancies in the first part of that URL, then you should probably stop and not take any further action. The New Zealand Post is a good example of an attempt to make it look legitimate, but it's not. It's nzpost.life. That's not legitimate. That's not what we would expect to see for New Zealand Post. So that's another really good red flag. The other thing we can do for these sorts of things is actually just stop and think a bit about the context. So, for example, I live in Wellington and we don't have any toll roads. So if I receive this text message, I say, well, I haven't driven on a toll road, so I know that this is probably a scam. I can probably report it and delete it and not worry too much about it. The NZ Post one is a bit tricky because we're all hoping to receive a package, and that's quite common. You may not necessarily know whether that's coming or not, but certainly do stop and think before you click on links. Does this align with actually some business activities or personal activities you've got going on in your life? Does it make sense? Is it plausible? Because these scammers are really relying on us being busy and distracted. So if we could just slow down and think, we will help defeat them. Thanks, B. So just a quick recap on where we're at with phishing. So there's some really simple steps we can take to identify phishing scams. We want to check where the message is coming from. We want to check where it's sending us to. And we also want to check the content and the context. Does it match the way that these organizations communicate with us? For example, banks have recently committed to removing links from text messages. So moving forward, you will not receive a text message with a link in it from your bank. And if you do, you should delete it. So good to have that knowledge and awareness around the way that these legitimate organizations communicate with you versus what is unexpected or what is out of the norm. And if you're not sure, the safest thing to do is simply to call that organisation and confirm with them whether they sent you that email or text message. If you do receive some of these, you can send them through to the relevant authorities. So spam and scam text messages are overseen by the digital messaging team at the Department of Internal Affairs. You can simply forward that text to 7726, and if you want, you can also delete it and block that sender. Same with emails, although those get reported to us here at CERT New Zealand, you can send them to us. Now, we talked before about how people don't report issues because I think it's potentially because they don't know what value it will bring. Here at CERT New Zealand, we actually run a system that's designed to disrupt phishing by taking those emails and distributing what we call indicators of compromise to our industry partners. So when you do send that to us, not only does it ensure that we know about it and we can share that learning from it, but also it helps us to stop other people from receiving and clicking on those emails. So please do send those through to us. They're really valuable, and you will be doing your part to protect New Zealand by reporting fraudulent text messages and emails. Thanks, B. Now we're going to move on and talk a little bit about online scams targeting businesses. Now, there are an absolute plethora of different types of fraud and scams out there. And today we're going to really zone in on a couple that we see most commonly affecting businesses. Now, there are certainly very vast number of other types, and we're not going to have time to cover them all today, but I do hope you find this useful. Thanks, B. We're going to start talking about business email compromises. Now, this is essentially where an attacker gets into your email account without your permission and will then start to carry out scams or attacks. And this is quite significant because not only does it mean that it looks like you when emails are coming out, it can have a huge impact on not only your business operations, but trust and confidence in your business. So this is quite a serious issue for businesses when they do fall foul of a business email compromise. But as I said, don't worry, I've got some tips for you on what you can do about these. Thanks, B. The reason why scammers are going after your email addresses is because those email accounts hold so much really, really valuable information. It could be commercially sensitive information about your business operations. It may be your databases with all your client lists. And once they have access to your account, they can actually send out emails that look like they're coming from you. What they could do is they could put a malicious attachment onto an email and send it to all your clients, and then it could infect those clients if they click on that. They could send phishing emails like the ones we saw before. For example, that first one in particular could be coming from a legitimate business employee's email address asking someone within their business to make a payment. So it's not always coming from a mimicked account. It could come from the legitimate account, which is why it's so important we look for the context as well when we're looking at phishing emails. The other thing they can do, which we see quite commonly, really unfortunately, is carry out what's called an invoice scam. And this is where they may email your clients and say, hey, it's us, the business you have a relationship with. We've changed our bank account. Please send payment for this invoice to this new bank account number. And if it's coming from your email address, it looks very legitimate. And that can be a really, really difficult situation to find yourselves in. Thanks, B. The good news is that there's actually some really simple things we can do to keep our email accounts nice and secure. First of all, have a really robust password policy in your organization. And we'll talk a little bit about passwords in a minute, so we will come back to that. The other thing we recommend is turning on two-factor authentication on your email account. And that might be the system where you get a pop-up on an authenticator app or perhaps a text message when you log in to confirm that it's you. Again, we'll talk about 2FA a bit more in a moment. The other thing we recommend is just double checking any new or different account numbers before you pay any invoices. Now, really pleasing to hear the banking industry is looking at introducing a confirmation of payee system that will match names, which we hope will have a significant impact in reducing invoice scams. But in the meantime, we do need to be vigilant to these sorts of threats and just make sure if we've got a request to change a bank account that we're confident that that is correct. And you can always call that organisation on their number or through a different contact method just to check that. If you do find yourself a victim of a business email compromise, what we would recommend you do is have a chat with your IT provider and ask them to check your systems, including whether there's been any malware placed on your devices or network. The other thing you can do is you can report these issues to us. As I said before, we do have preventative actions that we operate to try and shut down these types of threats, and we can also offer tailored personal instant response advice to your organisation to help you identify what went wrong, how to recover, and how to prevent that in the future. Thanks, B. We'll move on to talk about remote access scams. This is another type of scam that unfortunately does sometimes trip up some small businesses. A remote access scam is essentially where a scammer calls you up and tells you there's some sort of problem, and they'll ask you to give them remote access to your computer or mobile device. Remote access just means that a person who's not physically in front of your computer can virtually control your computer from a remote location. They may be using software like AnyDesk or TeamViewer. So if you do get a request from anyone asking you to give them remote access to your device, it's a really strong indicator that something's not right. So just pause and think. What they're often after in these sorts of scams is to get into your bank account, and they may be able to trick you into logging in, and they may see your username, or if you've got your details saved in your browser, they're going to be straight in. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of those tips on how you can prevent people getting in. Thanks, B. Often these remote access scams will vary in their typology. So they used to impersonate really big organizations, software companies like Microsoft. Then they moved to impersonating telcos. More recently, they have been impersonating banks. And when they are impersonating these organizations, they are mimicking their business operations to give it a bit more credibility. They can be quite tricky to spot. And sometimes they are involved, they may not involve using remote access to get into your bank account, but they may be asking you to make payments. So if you're receiving a phone call that has any of the elements that I've talked about today, just be really careful. My pro tips for helping you prevent remote access scams are to not give remote access to someone unless you requested it first. I'm not going to tell you to not use remote access because it is actually a really useful tool for addressing technical issues. But like any sort of technical tool, it is important to be aware of the risks and what safeguards you should have in place. So my second tip is to not access any banking or sensitive information during a remote access session. If it's not something you would be comfortable with someone looking over your shoulder and seeing, you should not be accessing it when someone has remote access. As I mentioned, sometimes these attackers can get straight into your banking if you've saved your passwords in your browser. So I recommend against saving your passwords in your browser. We will talk a bit more about passwords and password managers in a moment, and I'll give you some tips on some safe ways to store your passwords or to set appropriate passwords if you need it. If you get such a call, you can report the phone number that called you to your telecommunications company, and what they can do is work to shut down that number so that they can't call anyone else from that number. You can also report the scam to us here at CERT New Zealand for the previously mentioned reasons. We can help you recover from that and work to shut it down too. Thanks, B. I thought I would touch briefly on malware and ransomware as well, because those are your more traditional cybersecurity threats. But as we saw at the beginning, they are quite low in their occurrence. But if they do happen, they can be quite devastating. So I thought I would run you through briefly what those are and what you can potentially do about those. So malware, the term is simply an amalgamation of the words malicious and software. Essentially, most commonly, you'll see it as an attachment on an email, or perhaps a virus transmitted through a portable device, or sometimes it's something you download from the internet. Its sole purpose is to cause havoc in your network or operating systems, to spread itself throughout your network for various nefarious purposes. They might be trying to steal data. They might be trying to spy on your operations. They may be looking to seize things up. Thanks, B. When they're looking to seize things up, often what it is a ransomware attack. So ransomware is essentially a type of malware where they attempt to extort money from you. So they will deny you access to your systems until you pay a ransom. This is absolutely illegal. This is a crime, and it is a really horrible thing to happen. They may also threaten to leak private data to the public. So if you're an organization that collects personal information and you have an obligation to keep that information safe, that can actually be really damaging to your reputation. We do not recommend paying ransoms or giving in to demands from any attackers. They may threaten these things, but what happens if you do pay is that you indicate that you're willing to pay. I know that sounds self-evident, but there's no guarantee that they will then release your systems, and they may demand more money, or they may simply disclose that information anyway. If you find yourself on one of these, you will probably need some expert advice. Do let us know and we can help with that. But really, ransomware attacks can happen to anyone. These sorts of things happen to individuals. There are a spate of these where they were pretending to be the police and saying, we've found that you've been looking at objectionable material, you have to pay us this, we've locked up your computer to release it, do this. But also the small businesses can suffer similarly, and large companies, government organisations as well. Some pretty famous examples include Latitude Financial Service. There was other breaches for malware, and things include the Waikato DHB, the Reserve Bank. No one is really immune from these threats. Those are just the most publicly known ones, but certainly anyone can be impacted if they don't have good cybersecurity controls in place. Thanks, B. The best thing you can do to protect yourself from malware and ransomware is to educate your staff about those threats, because people can be our strongest cybersecurity defense, but also to have critical controls in place to stop access, unauthorized access, prevent them being able to spread throughout your networks and systems, and to actually mitigate the impact. If you do find yourself the victim of a malware or ransomware attack, contact your IT provider for advice and support, and report it to us here at CERT New Zealand, and we'll help you too. Right, now that's a whole bunch of really scary stuff, and as we've gone through it, I've let you know how to spot it and how to respond to it, but I also want to share with you some proactive preventative tips that I hope will keep you safe from even encountering these in the first instance. We've got 5 top tips that we share here at CERT New Zealand, and then 10 more advanced ones for businesses. So let's kick off with the first one. It's around passwords. So at CERT New Zealand, we recommend using long, strong, unique passwords. And I know this is really difficult. I struggle with this myself. The average person has 60 to 100 online accounts, and it's impossible to remember long, strong, unique passwords for all of them. So what we recommend is starting with your 4 most critical accounts and making sure that they have really, really robust passwords that are long, strong, and unique. We recommend using a passphrase that's 4 or more words. So the complexities of passwords that are shorter with numbers, symbols, and letters mixed in are not as secure as a longer password. So that may make that easier to remember, and it does also make it really secure. Steer clear from common patterns. I know it's really tempting when you have to change your password. It's pushing you to update it just to change one letter or add an exclamation mark or use an @ symbol instead of an A. I'm telling you this because I know it, and we all know then that the cyber attackers know it. So they may try and guess passwords based on predictable patterns. And they also know that people use personal information as the basis for their passwords. So steer clear from anything like pets' names, spouses' names, street addresses, anything that's related to you that could potentially be used to guess your password. If you're wondering whether your password or your email has potentially been compromised, there is a website called haveibeenpwned.com, which is really cool. If you put in your email account, it will tell you if that's been involved in a data breach. If it has, it will tell you the date, and you need to have a think about whether you're still using that password. If you are, you need to immediately change it and change it across any other accounts where you may have used that same password. If you've changed it since, you're probably okay, but certainly if you are concerned, feel free to get some professional advice tailored to your specific situation. Thanks, B. The next tip that we have is around two-factor authentication, and I touched on this earlier because it is a really strong layer of protection to protect you if someone has got your username and password or your email account and password, because this actually triggers a code, whether that's through an authenticator app or a text message, that you need to enter to confirm that it's you. So it stops attackers from getting into your accounts with just those credentials alone. It's really powerful. Now, the scammers know that a lot of people use 2FA, so a lot of scams are now developing to phish 2FA codes. So what I would recommend is just being very careful when you receive 2FA codes, and take the time and check that what the code is saying it's for matches what you're doing. So if it doesn't, do not enter it anywhere. Hang up and call whoever you think you're dealing with. Maybe it's your bank. Because, yeah, as I said, sometimes the scammers are tricking people into sharing those codes, and they're relying on us being busy and compliant. And if we can just slow down a little bit, we will thwart them. Thanks, B. Updates. This is the simplest thing to do. There is a setting on your device that you can turn on to automatically get updates, as opposed to doing it yourself. When a patch comes out on an app or a device, it's a public signal that there's a known vulnerability in that software. So the longer you leave it to get updated, the higher the chance that a scammer may exploit that vulnerability. So do make sure that you get any weaknesses fixed ASAP. And as I said, the easiest way to do it is to change your settings on your device to make sure that it does that straight away. I mentioned before that people often use their personal information to choose their passwords, so your privacy is actually a really important consideration. Have a think about what you are sharing online. Are you oversharing? For example, those really fun quizzes that ask you things like, where'd you grow up? What's your best memory? What was your favorite pet? All of that is designed to get you to share personal information, potentially that could be you may have used as a basis for your password. So just be really careful about what you're sharing and why, and who you're sharing it with. So for example, I use social media to connect with my friends and family. I don't want to use it to share my life's events with the whole world. So I have my privacy settings set to private so that only the people I want to know my personal business can access that. So have a think about that and see if that's appropriate for you. Thanks, B. Now, this theme will have come through really strong in a lot of what I've talked about, which is stop and think. The scammers are absolutely taking advantage of the fact that you as business owners are really busy, and that you are potentially looking just to get quick wins, click, click, click. And to a certain extent, we are conditioned just to be compliant. You get a pop-up, you hit yes. We don't really stop and think about it, but it is absolutely a critical control to keep yourself safe from cyber attacks. So not only is it about slowing down and thinking when you get an email, but also just double checking anything that seems a little bit unusual. Because the old adage, it's cliche, but it's still on point. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Thanks, B. Now, we do have a range of more advanced top tips for businesses. I won't go through them all now because we don't have the time. And some of these are replicated from what I've just talked about, like 2FA installing updates. Do check these out on our website if you have the time. These are much more directed towards people who have administrative functions within their business. So if you are an employee, the tips I just shared will be relevant to you, but maybe these tips might not be. But certainly make sure that the appropriate person within your organization knows about these top tips and how you can keep your wider business network secure. If you want more information, if you want more detail on any of the things I've talked about, do check out our website. It's ownyouronline.govt.nz/business. It has a fantastic range of guides and resources to help you know the risks of what's out there in the cyber landscape, but also really practical advice like the things I've shared with you today about how you can get protected. That brings us to the end of my part. Thank you so much for listening. I'll hand back over to Mark now.
Thank you, Erica. Wow. If that doesn't give you a call to action, I don't know what would. Yeah, it's frightening, and I can just tell you, while I was listening to this, and just looking at my notes, I also got a message that there's another fairly large-scale scam going around, a Bank of America one. So just watch out for that in case you get a phone call. Look, it really is frightening, and we do want you to take some action from this webinar. And what we'd love you to do is just take a pact with us to fight cyber crime. And it's really easy. All of those things are covered up in this webinar. Erica covered many of them off, so I won't run through it, but for you, especially I think is really important is training of your staff. So you may well have gone through all this, etc., but if you haven't trained your staff around the risks, you're still wide open to risks in terms of invoice fraud, all that sort of side of things. So just skip forward. Thanks, B. So yeah, and so it's equally important for your staff. So you will get a copy of this video and slides come through to you anyway. So if you haven't brought your staff onto the webinar, I know some people have, it'd be a really good idea to run through with them the webinar, but particularly some of the simple actions to stop fraud and scams in your business. So yeah, just make sure you include your staff as well. Now, just a reminder, I can see that some Q&A has been coming in, but if you've got any questions, we'll do a couple of questions. We'll probably only have time for one or two at the end of this. This also as a reminder, there's a lot of information on the ANZ sites around scams and frauds. A good one to download is the guides. It's freely available. Just go online and download a copy of it. If you've got anything suspicious, just come through to the 0800 line there. There is, it's a very, very busy line because there's an awful lot of scams and frauds going on. So, but just report it through. Erica's really covered those protection tools. There's a lot of information on the site and on the various means of interacting with ANZ, but make sure you've got all those protection tools in place in terms of banking systems and what have you. And also just a reminder, we have a feedback poll. I know it's a very, very quick one, so it'll go up, and it's just around how you would rate the webinar, etc. So I just encourage you to fill that out as well. Now, look, just conscious of time, so I'm just going to kick into a couple of quick questions that have come up for Erica. I'm just wanting to know, so this question is really around, we hear a lot about cloud technology. Is it safe to use, and should I be using it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So let's start just by talking a bit about what cloud is. So essentially, cloud is a term that describes third-party service providers who can store information for you online. So essentially, it's an alternative to saving it on your own hard drive or network. Now, what that means is predominantly that you're trusting a third party with your valuable information. So while it is generally considered quite convenient and secure, it does come with some risks around the fact that that is a third party service provider. So you want to have a little bit of a think if you're going to use cloud service options about what are the risks, what happens if that data is lost, what if that organization experiences some sort of data breach. So it's important to think through those risks and the potential cybersecurity solutions you could put in place to address them. For example, whether you want to have that information encrypted if it's stored in that method, and whether you can back it up in some other way in the event that it's not accessible.
Excellent, thank you. Another question here, and you sort of covered it a little bit in the presentation, but I'll still ask it. With more and more business owners doing their business via mobile, should they be considering buying antivirus protection or other device, in terms of device providers like Samsung covering this on your device, so antivirus protection?
Oh, that's a tricky one. The short answer is it depends,
Yeah.
because the business needs will vary depending on what type of business you're running, what type of function you have within that business. So if you're just using your phone to make phone calls, and it has quite a limited use, you may be pretty well protected by some of those standard security offerings that come with devices. Those are good options. But if you're using it for example, to make payments, or you're concerned about cybersecurity, certainly some of those more advanced offerings, like antivirus software and things like that, can help. I would caveat that to say that antivirus software is not a solution for other cybersecurity practices. So it's not a case of simply making sure you've got software and job done, because a lot of fraud and scams or cyber threats faced by businesses actually involve social engineering techniques to manipulate us into doing things without us realizing what we're doing. And antivirus will not necessarily protect against those types of threats.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. Let's see if I can find any. Looks like everything there. Look, finally, a big thank you to Erica. Really informative webinar, I think, and really also a call to action, I think, for businesses and us personally. I know it gave me a reminder. We in the banking industry get reminders every day, and so really, really important to take action from this. You can go on for more information onto the anz.co.nz/banksafe, and you will get a recording sent through to you of this webinar in the next few days. So look, thank you very much. Really good webinar and really great insights. Thank you very much and have a good day.